A dark country road, two teenagers in a car laughing about nothing, and then gunfire. By the time it stopped, both of them were dead. No one heard a scream, no one saw a face. And the man who pulled the trigger would spend the next 5 decades sending letters to the police bragging about it, and he would never, ever be caught. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer. It's December 20th, 1968. The town of Vallejo, California is small and quiet, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seems to happen. Christmas lights hang in windows, families are getting ready for the holidays. And 17-year-old Betty Lou Jensen is getting ready for her very first date with a boy from school, David Faraday. David is 16, polite, a little nervous. He borrows his parents' car and picks Betty Lou up that evening. They aren't going anywhere special, just out the way teenagers do when they want a few hours away from home. Later, they drive out to Lake Herman Road, a dark, empty stretch just outside town, popular with local couples looking for a quiet place to park and talk. It's just past 11 p.m. The road is empty. The night is still. Neither of them notices the second car pull up behind them. Inside their car, Betty Lou feels a small flicker of unease. She turns to David. "Do you think we should go?" she asks. "It feels weird out here." David glances in the mirror, just another car parked a little ways back, probably nothing. "We can head out in a bit," he says. "Don't worry," but someone is watching them. A figure steps out of the second car, walking slowly toward them in the dark. He doesn't say a word, he doesn't ask for money, he doesn't ask for anything at all. Then the first shot rings out. David is hit almost instantly. Betty Lou tries to run, she makes it only a few feet from the car before more shots follow her into the darkness. In seconds, it's over. The gunman turns, walks back to his car, and drives away into the night as calm as if nothing happened at all. A passing driver spots the bodies minutes later and calls the police. When officers arrive, they find a scene that makes no sense. Nothing was stolen. Betty Lou's purse is untouched. There's no sign of a struggle beyond the shooting itself, no argument, no motive, nothing connecting these two ordinary teenagers to anyone who might want them dead. Whoever did this didn't know them. He didn't need a reason. The case goes cold almost immediately. Detectives have no lids, no suspects, no answers to give two grieving families. For a while, Vallejo tells itself this was a horrible, random tragedy, a one-time nightmare that won't happen again. They have no idea it's only the beginning. 7 months later, on a warm July night, another couple will park in another quiet spot. And the same gunman will return, only this time someone will survive to tell the world what he looks like. 7 months pass. Vallejo slowly exhales. The murders on Lake Herman Road fade into whispered rumor, the kind of story parents tell their kids to explain why they should be home before dark. No new lids, no new victims. Maybe people start to believe it really was a one-time horror. They are wrong. It's July 4th, 1969. Independence Day. Fireworks crackle somewhere in the distance as 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin and 19-year-old Mike Majo sit talking in a parked car at Blue Rock Springs, a golf course area just a few miles from where Betty Lou and David died. Darlene is warm, funny, well-liked, the kind of person who makes friends everywhere she goes. Mike barely knows her, but he likes her already. The night feels easy, ordinary. Then headlights sweep in behind them. A second car pulls up close, parking just a few feet away. Neither of them thinks much of it until the driver gets out. He walks toward Mike's window carrying a flashlight, and for a moment Mike assumes it's a cop ready to tell them to move along. It isn't. The man lifts the light and shines it directly into their faces, blinding them both. Before Mike can speak, before he can even process what's happening, gunfire erupts from the darkness behind the beam. "Get down," Mike screams, but there's nowhere to go. Bullet after bullet tears into the car. Darlene is hit first, her body slumping forward. Mike feels the impact rip through his own neck, his shoulder, his legs, and then, strangely, silence. The shooter turns and walks back toward his car, unhurried, the same eerie calm that marked the killings on Lake Herman Road months earlier. Mike lies still, playing dead, blood pooling beneath him. Through blurred vision, he watches the man pause, then walk back toward the car a second time, as if to make sure the job is finished. More shots ring out before the killer finally disappears into the night. Somehow Mike is still breathing. A passerby hears the commotion and calls for help. When police and paramedics arrive, they find Darlene barely alive. She'll die in the hospital within the hour. Mike miraculously survives, badly wounded but alive enough to talk. In the hospital, shaking, still in shock, Mike gives officers what little he can. He was stocky, Mike tells them, his voice barely above a whisper. Kind of heavyset, maybe 26, 27, brown curly hair. It isn't much, but it's more than anyone had after Lake Herman Road, because for the first time someone lived to describe the killer's face. Detectives lean in closer. They need everything Mike can remember, the shape of his jaw, the sound of his voice, anything at all. But Mike's mind keeps circling back to the same terrifying thought. This man didn't just get lucky twice. He came back to make sure Mike was dead. He wanted no witnesses. And yet here Mike is alive, and now the only person on earth who has looked this killer in the eye and survived. Detectives leave the hospital that night with a sketch taking shape and a sinking feeling settling over the department. 2 attacks months apart, both without motive, both without warning. Whoever did this is still out there. He isn't finished, and soon he won't just kill in silence. He'll want everyone to know exactly what he's done. 3 weeks after Blue Rock Springs, while detectives are still chasing Mike Majo's fractured memories, something arrives that changes the case entirely. On August 1st, 1969, three Bay Area newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner, each receive an identical letter in the mail. The handwriting is blocky, uneven, almost childlike in places. But what stops each editor cold isn't the handwriting. It's the symbol drawn at the top of the page, a circle with a cross through it like the crosshairs of a rifle scope. Below it, 3 pages of jumbled letters, numbers, and symbols, a cipher unreadable at a glance. And beneath that, a message that makes the newsroom go silent. The writer claims responsibility for the murders at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. He describes details of the crimes that were never released to the public, details only the killer could know, and then comes the threat that will define the next 50 years of this case. "I want you to print this cipher on your front page," the letter demands. "If you do not print it, I will go on a kill rampage." He signs it with a name the world hasn't heard yet, Zodiac. In the Chronicle newsroom, an editor reads the letter twice, then a third time, hands trembling slightly. He picks up the phone to call Vallejo police. Within hours, detectives are gathered around a desk, staring down at a killer's handwriting for the first time and an ultimatum that puts them in an impossible position. "If we print it, we're giving a murderer exactly what he wants," one detective says. "If we don't and he does what he's threatening." Nobody finishes that sentence. Nobody has to. There's a deeper fear sitting underneath the immediate one too, a question no one wants to ask out loud. If this man wanted attention, why send a cipher no one can read? What if the code isn't just a taunt? What if it actually reveals who he is? After tense discussion between police, the newspapers, and even the FBI, the decision is made. The letters are printed. The cipher runs across the front pages of all 3 papers, exactly as demanded, 3 columns of nonsense symbols that the entire Bay Area now stares at, trying to make sense of a killer's mind. For the public, this is the moment the nightmare stops being a local rumor and becomes something else entirely. A story with a name, a symbol, and a voice. People who had barely registered the deaths at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs now read every word of the letter twice, feeling a cold new fear settle over daily life. Parents grip their children's hands a little tighter walking to school. Couples cancel plans to park anywhere quiet after dark. A killer who once operated in silence has just introduced himself to millions of strangers and made it clear he wants to be watched. Detectives pore over the cipher for days, convinced the answer to the killer's identity might be hiding in plain sight, encoded in those strange rows of symbols. But code-breaking takes time, and time is something Zodiac seems determined not to give them, because this isn't the last letter he'll send. And soon he won't just write about killing from a distance. He'll want to show them exactly how it happens up close in broad daylight with 2 more victims who never see it coming until it's far too late. While the Bay Area is still gripped by fear over the cipher, Zodiac is already planning his next move, and this time he won't hide in darkness at all. It's September 27, 1969, a bright, sunny afternoon at Lake Berryessa, about an hour outside Vallejo. 20-year-old Brian Hartnell and 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard, both college students, have driven out for a peaceful afternoon by the water. They spread a blanket on a small, secluded peninsula overlooking the lake, laughing, talking, enjoying a rare quiet day away from campus. Neither of them notices the man watching from a distance until it's too late. He emerges from the tree line slowly, and what they see makes Cecilia grab Brian's arm without thinking. The man is wearing a black hood over his entire head and shoulders, cut with square eye holes. Sewn onto the front of his chest is a white patch, the same crossed circle symbol from the letters, now stitched onto a living, breathing man standing just yards away. He's carrying a gun. Brian's mind races, trying to make sense of what's happening. This has to be some kind of joke, he tells himself. A prank, a costume, something absurd that will end with everyone laughing about it later. It doesn't end that way. The hooded man speaks calmly, almost politely, explaining that he's an escaped convict who needs money and a car to get to Mexico. His voice is steady, unhurried, there's no panic in it, no anger. He asks Brian to tie up Cecilia first, then ties Brian himself, checking the ropes with an unsettling, methodical care as if this were something he'd rehearsed. "I'm going to have to stab you people," he tells them almost gently, like he's announcing a change in weather. For a moment, neither of them can speak. "Please," Cecilia says, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this? We don't even know you." The man doesn't answer. What happens next is fast and brutal. He stabs Brian first, again and again, the blade tearing through his back as Brian lies helpless, bound and unable to defend himself. Then he turns to Cecilia, stabbing her even more times, ignoring her screams echoing across the empty lake. When it's over, the man calmly walks to Brian and Cecilia's car, parked nearby, and uses a felt-tip pen to draw the same cross-circle symbol directly onto the driver's door. Beneath it, he writes the dates of his previous attacks, Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and today's date at Lake Berryessa, like a resume of murder, left in plain sight for police to find. Then he simply walks away. For long, agonizing minutes, Brian and Cecilia lie bleeding on the blanket alone, no one around to help. Somehow impossibly, Brian manages to work himself free enough to crawl toward the road, leaving a trail of blood behind him, screaming for help that seems like it will never come. A fisherman finally spots him and calls for help. Paramedics rush both victims to the hospital. Brian survives, though barely, the wounds nearly fatal, his recovery long and painful. Cecilia is not as fortunate. She dies 2 days later from her injuries, one more name added to a growing list of lives Zodiac has taken without hesitation or explanation. When Brian is finally well enough to speak with detectives, he gives them something no one else has been able to offer: a close, direct account of the killer's calm, almost businesslike demeanor. Not rage, not panic, just quiet, practiced control, as if killing were simply a task to be completed and then walked away from. It's the most detailed description police have gotten yet, and it terrifies them more than any of the ones before it because it means this isn't a man losing control. It's a man in complete command of himself. And less than 2 weeks later, in the middle of San Francisco, in front of witnesses on a crowded street, he'll prove just how far that chilling calm can carry him. Less than 2 weeks after Lake Berryessa, Zodiac makes good on that quiet, terrifying confidence, and this time he brings his violence into the heart of San Francisco itself. It's the night of October 11th, 1969. Paul Stine, a 29-year-old cab driver working to put himself through graduate school, picks up a fare near Union Square. The passenger is an ordinary-looking man who asks to be taken to the intersection of Washington and Maple Streets, a quiet residential corner in the Presidio Heights neighborhood. Paul has driven hundreds of fares like this one. There's nothing about tonight that should feel different. He has no way of knowing he's just picked up the same man who tied Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard to the ground 2 weeks earlier. As the cab pulls up near the intersection, something goes wrong. Instead of paying and stepping out, the passenger leans forward. A gunshot rings out inside the cab, close and sudden, and Paul Stine slumps over the wheel, killed almost instantly. Just across the street, 3 teenagers sitting in a window happen to glance outside at exactly the wrong or right moment. They watch a man climb out of the cab, lean back inside toward Paul's body, and tear a piece of fabric from his blood-stained shirt, tucking it into his pocket like some kind of trophy. Then he calmly wipes down parts of the cab, steps out, and walks off into the dark unhurried, as if he hasn't just taken a man's life feet from a family's living room window. The teenagers, stunned, call the police immediately. And this is where the case takes its most devastating turn. Officers rush to the scene within minutes. A radio dispatch goes out describing the suspect, a white man, medium build, possibly wearing glasses. But somewhere in the chaos of relaying that description, a critical detail is garbled. Dispatch describes the suspect as black rather than white, sending responding officers scanning the streets for the wrong man entirely. As 2 patrol officers canvass the area on foot, they pass a white man walking calmly along the sidewalk just blocks from the murder scene. He doesn't run. He doesn't flinch. He simply nods, almost politely, and mentions that he saw a man with a gun running through a nearby yard, pointing them off in another direction entirely. The officers thank him and keep moving. It will take investigators years to fully understand what happened in that moment, that the calm, cooperative man who pointed them the wrong way was in all likelihood Zodiac himself, standing close enough to answer their questions, close enough to touch, and walking away untouched because of one garbled radio call. When detectives finally piece it together, the realization is almost unbearable. They had him. For a few seconds on a quiet street in Presidio Heights, San Francisco police stood face to face with the man they'd been hunting for nearly a year, and let him walk straight past them. Back at the crime scene, investigators recover a bloody palm print from the cab, and a torn piece of Paul Stine's shirt is later mailed to the Chronicle, along with another taunting letter, proving beyond doubt that the man from the cab and the man from Lake Berryessa are one and the same. The letter mocks the police directly, boasting about the murder and referencing the botched search that let him slip away. For the detectives on this case, including one man about to become its most consumed investigator, this night becomes something they will never fully let go of. A murder committed in a residential neighborhood, witnessed by teenagers, investigated within minutes, and still somehow unsolved because of one small human error. It's the closest anyone will ever come to catching Zodiac in the act. And it's the moment that will haunt Inspector Dave Toschi for the rest of his career. The case that will consume him, define him, and ultimately cost him more than he ever imagined it could. In the days after Paul Stine's murder, one man is handed the case that will define and quietly unravel the rest of his career. His name is Dave Toschi, a San Francisco homicide inspector known for his sharp instincts and his distinctive style, right down to the hand-tooled holster he wears across his chest. Colleagues admire him. The press likes him even more, but nothing in Toschi's experience has prepared him for a killer like this. From the moment he takes the case, it becomes personal in a way homicide rarely is. Most murders have a motive: jealousy, money, revenge, something that eventually makes sense. This one has none of that. Just a man who kills strangers for no reason at all, then writes letters bragging about it afterward. And soon, those letters start arriving addressed directly to Toschi himself. Zodiac writes to him by name, taunting him, referencing details of the investigation that should never have reached the public. He mocks the department's failures, boasts about outsmarting them, and dangles claims of more victims than police can ever confirm, numbers that climb into the dozens, though most are never substantiated. Every letter sends detectives scrambling, chasing down claims that lead nowhere, wasting precious time on a killer who seems to enjoy watching them run in circles. "He wants us exhausted," Toskai tells a colleague late one night, staring at another envelope spread across his desk. "He's not just killing people, he's playing a game, and he's winning." The city, meanwhile, is gripped by something close to hysteria. Newspapers run daily updates. Radio stations speculate about the killer's identity. Strangers eye each other nervously on the street, wondering if the quiet man standing next to them might be the one writing those letters. Zodiac has become more than a criminal. He's become a kind of dark celebrity, a name whispered in fear across the entire Bay Area. For Toskai, the pressure becomes suffocating. He works impossibly long hours, chasing leads that dissolve the moment he gets close, staring at handwriting samples until the letters blur together. Sleep becomes rare. His home life, like so many in his position, quietly strains under the weight of a job that never seems to end. Every unsolved night adds to a growing sense that this case isn't just difficult, it might be unsolvable, and that thought eats at him more than he'll ever admit out loud. The media attention only makes things harder. Toskai becomes something of a public face for the investigation, admired by reporters, even loosely inspiring fictional detectives in films. A strange, uncomfortable kind of fame built on a case he can't close. Every interview, every headline adds more pressure to deliver an arrest the evidence simply won't allow. Behind closed doors, frustration builds inside the department. Detectives argue over theories. Tips flood in by the thousands, most of them useless, some deliberately misleading. Somewhere in that avalanche of information might be the one detail that finally identifies Zodiac, but finding it feels like searching for a single grain of sand on an endless beach. Toskai refuses to let the case go cold even as the trail does. He keeps every letter, every clipping, every theory scribbled on scraps of paper late at night when sleep won't come. Because somewhere in all of it, he believes, the answer is hiding in plain sight. And soon, thanks to two amateur codebreakers working nowhere near a police station, part of that answer is about to surface, cracking open the killer's own words, and revealing just how much he wanted the world to understand exactly who he was. While Toskai and his team chase leads through official channels, the answer to the killer's first cipher comes from somewhere no one expects. A high school teacher in Salinas, California, and his wife, working at their kitchen table with nothing but pencils, patience, and a shared curiosity that refuses to quit. Donald and Betty Harden aren't detectives. They aren't cryptographers by trade. But when they read about the three-part cipher printed across the front pages back in August, something about it pulls them in. Night after night, they sit together, testing letter substitutions, searching for patterns, refusing to accept that a killer's code could really be unbreakable. He wants someone to solve it, Donald tells his wife one evening, staring at rows of symbols scattered across their table. That's the whole point. He's not hiding, he's showing off. That instinct turns out to be the key. Instead of treating the cipher like a locked vault, they treat it like a puzzle designed to be opened, and slowly, painstakingly, the symbols start to give way to words. What emerges chills them both into silence. The decoded message isn't a confession born of guilt, and it isn't an explanation rooted in anger or revenge. It's something colder than that. The killer describes hunting people as the most exciting kind of game. There is more thrilling, he claims, than hunting any wild animal because unlike animals, human beings understand what's happening to them and feel fear as it happens. He writes that he expects to be reborn in an afterlife where the people he's killed will become his slaves. There's no remorse in any of it, no hesitation. Just a calm, almost proud description of violence as entertainment. The Hardens immediately hand their solution over to police, and within days it's confirmed and released to the public. Newspapers print the decoded message in full, and for the first time the Bay Area isn't just afraid of an unknown killer lurking somewhere out there, they're afraid of what kind of mind could write something like this and mean every word. Panic spreads fast. Phones ring off the hook at police stations across California as anxious residents report suspicious neighbors, co-workers, even family members. Some tips are earnest attempts to help. Others are driven by nothing more than fear turning into suspicion, aimed at anyone who seems even slightly strange or out of place. Worse, the publicity brings out something else entirely: copycats. Letters claiming to be from Zodiac start arriving at newspapers and police stations from people who have nothing to do with the actual killings. Some trying to frighten their communities for attention, others seemingly fascinated by the idea of borrowing a real killer's infamy for themselves. Detectives now face the impossible task of separating authentic letters from imitations, knowing that missing even one real message could mean losing a critical clue or worse, ignoring a genuine threat. Through it all, the real Zodiac continues writing, clearly aware of the panic he's caused, seeming to feed off of it. His letters grow more taunting, referencing news coverage, mocking the investigation's lack of progress, occasionally including cryptic hints about his identity that lead nowhere when investigators chase them down. It becomes painfully clear that being known matters more to him than almost anything else, not fame in the traditional sense, but the specific twisted satisfaction of being feared by an entire region while remaining completely untouchable. For Toskai and his team, the cracked cipher offers no names, no addresses, nothing that points directly to an arrest. What it offers instead is a window into a mind that finds pleasure in exactly this kind of chaos: the fear, the confusion, the desperate scrambling of an entire police department. And soon that scrambling will finally produce a name. A real person flagged by someone who knew him, the closest the investigation will ever come to standing face to face with the man behind the mask. Years pass. The letters slow, then stop altogether for long stretches, leaving Toskai's team sifting through old evidence, old theories, old dead ends. And then in 1971, a phone call brings a name into the investigation that will follow the case for the rest of its existence: Arthur Lee Allen. The tip comes from someone who knew Allen personally, a man who describes him as unsettling, oddly fixated on violence, and eerily familiar with details of the Zodiac case that seem to go beyond simple public curiosity. Allen, a former elementary school teacher who had lost his job amid troubling allegations, lived not far from where several of the attacks took place. He owned guns. He kept a diary. And according to people who knew him, he'd made comments about the killings that struck them as far too knowing for someone with no connection to the case. For the first time in years, detectives feel something close to hope. When investigators finally search Allen's home in the 1990s, what they find only deepens the uncertainty rather than resolving it. There are knives, bomb-making materials. A watch stamped with the same cross-circle symbol Zodiac used to sign his letters, a detail that makes even seasoned detectives pause. Allen fits the general physical description given by surviving witnesses. He has the kind of quiet, unsettling demeanor that seems to match the calm, methodical nature of the attacks. And yet, nothing detectives find definitively places Allen at any crime scene. No confession. No forensic evidence directly tying him to the murders. Just circumstantial threads that seem compelling on their own but never quite weave into something solid enough to justify an arrest. "We keep finding pieces that fit," one investigator says, staring at the evidence laid out across a table. "But pieces that fit aren't proof. We need something that closes the door completely, and we don't have it." Handwriting experts compare Allen's writing samples to Zodiac's letters and come away divided, some seeing similarities, others insisting the styles don't match closely enough to be conclusive. Fingerprints lifted from Zodiac's letters and crime scenes don't match Allen's on file. Survivors are shown his photograph. Some feel a flicker of recognition, while others say with confidence that he isn't the man they remember from that terrifying night. It's a case built on almost evidence, close enough to feel like an answer, never quite close enough to be one. For detectives who have spent years chasing this investigation, the frustration is almost unbearable. They finally have a name, a face, a person who fits so many pieces of the puzzle, and still, the case refuses to close. Without a confession or definitive forensic proof, prosecutors know an arrest built on this evidence alone would likely collapse in court, and a failed prosecution could destroy any chance of ever bringing the real killer to justice, whether that's Allen or someone else entirely. So the investigation stalls in that agonizing gray area, neither cleared nor confirmed. A suspect who lives out the rest of his life never formally charged with anything connected to the Zodiac murders. Arthur Lee Allen dies in 1992, taking whatever he knew, guilty or innocent, with him. For the families who lost people on Lake Herman Road, at Blue Rock Springs, at Lake Berryessa, and in the back of a cab on a quiet San Francisco street, this isn't closure. It's a door left permanently ajar, one name added to a case that refuses to give them the one thing they need most. And for the investigators who worked this case for years, Allen's death only adds to a slow, painful truth beginning to settle over the entire department. That this case may never close the way they need it to. Even before Arthur Lee Allen's name ever surfaced, the investigation was already quietly falling apart in ways no single suspect could fix. Decades of missed connections, small failures, and simple bad luck had been eating away at the case long before anyone realized how much damage had already been done. Evidence collected in the early years, back when forensic science was still decades away from the tools investigators would eventually have access to, wasn't always preserved the way it needed to be. Samples degrade. Paperwork gets misfiled. Items get moved between evidence lockers, and somewhere in all that movement, small but critical pieces of the puzzle are lost or contaminated beyond usefulness. What might have been definitive proof, given the technology of a later decade, simply isn't available in a usable form by the time anyone thinks to look again. Witnesses, too, become a fading resource. Memory isn't a recording, it shifts and softens with time, no matter how vivid an experience once felt. Survivors who gave detailed descriptions in the immediate aftermath of an attack find their certainty wavering years later when shown photographs or asked to recall details under oath. It isn't dishonesty. It's simply what happens to memory under the crushing weight of trauma and time. But in a case that depends so heavily on eyewitness accounts, that fading becomes its own kind of evidence lost. Making matters worse, the murders themselves span multiple counties and jurisdictions, Vallejo, Napa, San Francisco, each with its own police department, its own detectives, its own theories about the case. Communication between departments isn't always smooth. Files aren't always shared as quickly or completely as they should be. Competing theories about the killer's identity create friction rather than collaboration, as different teams chase different leads without always comparing notes, wasting time that could have been spent working together. Then, in the mid-1970s, controversy strikes Toschi directly, unrelated to Zodiac itself, when questions are raised about letters allegedly sent under a pseudonym praising his own detective work. Toschi denies any wrongdoing, but the accusation is enough to force him off the case he has spent years of his life consumed by. For a man who had given nearly everything to this investigation, being pulled away from it feels like its own kind of loss, a final, painful irony in a career defined by a killer he was never allowed to finish chasing. I gave this case everything I had, Toschi later admits, reflecting on those years. And in the end, it still got away from me. Without Toschi's singular focus driving the investigation forward, the case slows even further. New detectives inherit boxes of old files, trying to make sense of a trail that's grown cold and disjointed over the years. Some pursue Arthur Lee Allen with renewed energy, others explore entirely different suspects, chasing theories that lead nowhere new. When Allen dies quietly in 1992, still never formally charged with anything connected to the murders, it feels less like an ending and more like confirmation of something investigators had feared for a long time, that whatever chance they'd had to definitively solve this case may have already slipped through their fingers years earlier, lost somewhere between mishandled evidence, fading memories, and departments that never quite worked as one. The case doesn't close. It simply goes quiet, boxes of evidence gathering dust in storage while the world slowly moves on. But quiet isn't the same as forgotten. Decades later, a new generation of investigators, armed with tools no one in 1969 could have imagined, will reopen those same dusty boxes, hoping that science might finally succeed where determination alone could not. For nearly 3 decades, the boxes sit in evidence storage, largely untouched, the case reduced to a cold file pulled out occasionally when a new tip trickles in. But in 2018, something happens hundreds of miles away that changes everything about how old, unsolved cases like this one are approached. The arrest of the Golden State Killer, caught not through a confession or a lucky break, but through genetic genealogy, a technique that uses DNA left at crime scenes to trace family trees until a single name emerges. Suddenly, cases that had gone cold for decades don't feel quite so hopeless anymore. Investigators return to the Zodiac evidence with fresh eyes, submitting old samples, envelope flaps, stamps licked and sealed by the killer himself half a century earlier, for forensic testing using methods that didn't exist when the letters were first written. It's a strange, quiet kind of hope, built not on new leads or new witnesses, but on the idea that a killer's own saliva, preserved by accident for 50 years, might finally succeed where every detective before them had failed. At the same time, something else begins happening outside official channels entirely. A dedicated community of amateur codebreakers and online researchers, many of them with no professional background in criminal investigation, start collaborating across forums and social media, sharing theories, comparing handwriting samples, and revisiting Zodiac's remaining uncracked ciphers with the same stubborn determination the Hardens once brought to their kitchen table decades earlier. In 2020, that persistence pays off. A team of 3 amateur codebreakers working independently, communicating online finally solves Zodiac's infamous 340-character cipher, one that had gone unbroken since 1969. The decoded message reveals more of the killer's chilling mindset, references to enjoying the fear he caused, but frustratingly it offers no name, no address, nothing that definitively identifies him. We keep getting closer to understanding who he was, one researcher explains afterward. But understanding someone and identifying them are 2 very different things. That gap between understanding and identification defines this entire chapter of the investigation. DNA testing on old evidence does yield partial genetic profiles, fragments degraded by decades of handling and storage, not complete enough to run through genealogy databases with full confidence. Some results seem to rule out Arthur Lee Allen entirely, while others remain frustratingly inconclusive, neither confirming nor eliminating him or any other named suspect with real certainty. For the families of victims, this new wave of attention brings a complicated mix of emotions. There's genuine hope, sharper and more real than anything they've felt in years, watching modern science accomplish things unimaginable in 1969. But there's also renewed grief, old wounds reopening every time a headline promises a breakthrough that ultimately dissolves into more uncertainty. Brian Hartnell, one of the last living survivors, speaks publicly during this period, his voice steady but weighted with decades of waiting. "I've stopped expecting an arrest," he admits in one interview. "What I want now is just to understand who he was and why. I think that's the closest thing to peace I'm ever going to get." Despite the excitement surrounding each new development, official law enforcement remains cautious, unwilling to name a suspect based on partial genetic evidence and cipher solutions that, while fascinating, still fall short of courtroom-level proof. The case technically remains open in multiple jurisdictions to this day, neither closed nor solved, sitting in that same painful gray area it's occupied for over 50 years. Technology has done what determination alone couldn't. It's brought the world closer to understanding this killer than ever before. But closer isn't the same as certain. And for everyone still waiting on an answer, that distinction has become its own quiet, ongoing tragedy. Because in the end, understanding a killer's mind was never the same as knowing his name. More than 50 years have passed since a teenage couple parked on a quiet road outside Vallejo, and the world that remembers Zodiac looks nothing like the one he terrorized. The letters have long since stopped. The newspapers that once printed his ciphers on their front pages have changed hands, changed formats, some closing entirely. And yet somehow his name has never faded. If anything, it's grown louder with time, a symbol of the one thing every investigator in this case feared most. A crime that could simply outlive everyone trying to solve it. Mike Majo, the teenager who survived Blue Rock Springs, carried that night with him for the rest of his life. He went on to live an ordinary life in many ways, work, family, the quiet passage of years, but the scars, both physical and otherwise, never fully left him. For decades, he watched from a distance as new suspects rose and fell, as documentaries retold his story again and again, each one asking him to relive a few terrifying minutes that changed everything for him at 19 years old. He passed away in 2021, having spent over half a century as the first living witness to a killer the world never named. Brian Hartnell, too, carried Lake Berryessa with him always, the ropes, the calm voice, the blade. He became a lawyer, built a life far from that lakeside blanket, and yet found himself again and again pulled back into interviews, documentaries, and true crime specials, asked to describe the same unhurried, chilling calm he witnessed that September afternoon. In his later years, he spoke less about catching the killer and more about simply understanding him, as if answers, even incomplete ones, might finally quiet something that facts alone never could. For the families of Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, Darlene Ferrin, Paul Stein, and Cecilia Shepard, there was no such thing as closure in the way the word is often used. There was only the slow, difficult work of living alongside an absence that never resolved itself, birthdays that came and went without answers, anniversaries marked by renewed media attention rather than justice. Grief, for them, never got to become the past tense. It stayed present year after year, decade after decade. And that, in the end, is what makes the Zodiac case different from so many others. It isn't simply that a killer was never caught. It's that an entire city, an entire generation of detectives, and dozens of ordinary people who never asked to be part of any of this were left permanently suspended between fear and unanswered questions. Dave Toskai, the detective who gave years of his life and his own reputation to this case, passed away in 2018, having spent decades wondering if the answer had been within reach all along. A name on a list, a man on a sidewalk, a piece of evidence lost somewhere along the way. Arthur Lee Allen remains, to many, the most likely suspect, a name forever tied to this case without ever being formally confirmed or cleared. Others believe the true killer's name has never surfaced at all, hiding in plain sight, an ordinary person who lived out an entirely unremarkable life after 1974, when his letters finally stopped for good. Maybe someday science will close the distance that determination alone never could. Maybe a name will finally surface, undeniable and certain. Or maybe this is simply one of those rare, haunting cases destined to remain open forever, a symbol not just of a killer's cruelty, but of how fragile justice can be when even a single detail slips through the cracks. What's certain is this: the victims were real people, with families who loved them, futures that were stolen, and names that deserve to be remembered long after the killer's identity fades into speculation and legend. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, subscribe, and follow the channel, because some cases never close and we're not done digging.